Okay, we're live. Hey, everybody. Hey, it's Friday. We're joined by the great and powerful Scott Edwards, looking rugged, looking hydrated, got his beard, got his Gatorade.
Ready to go.
We are ready to go, looking limber, looking healthy. What's up, Scott?
Hey, glad to be here. It's Friday.
It is Friday.
The background of the shot is, right in line with our weather here today.
Yes, it is.
Oh yeah, is it cold?
At least it's not 20 degrees. It's just very wet.
It's been in the 40s here in the greater Southern California region for a week, and I am I'm going insane. I hate it, and I want it to stop.
All the way down to the 40s.
Oh, careful.
It's terrible. It's terrible. I'm running out of layers. All righty, everybody. So like always, we'll start off with our sort of week in review. Scott will do your month in review, see what you've been up to, and then we'll jump into some of the questions that we had queued up from previous shows, and then we'll get into live questions from the chat. So Scott, we'll get started with you. Apparently you're going to be out and about in the ecosystem here coming up pretty soon, huh?
Yeah, and instead of a month in review, it's kind of a month in preview, if you will. January, just getting everything started for the year. Getting things set up, trying to make sure that we're all, prepped for success this coming 25. But in February, we've got two big conferences that we'll be out at. Write a Boom in Las Vegas. Really good conference. Andrew Morgan puts it on. And it's grown every year. I think this is year 4 for that conference. I believe it's year 4. And he always does a great job putting on a conference out there and brings a lot of MSSPs to the table. And just really good content. So looking forward to going out there to that. And then last week of the month, we'll be in Tampa for CUICon. And so looking forward to that as well. Matt Titcomb and Fernando and that team putting on CUICon. I think this is the second one. There was one that was supposed to be in Seattle, but I think that got pushed off to this year to Tampa. But I'll be speaking at that event. So, yeah, if any of you are going to be out there, would love to sit down with you. Grab a drink or whatever and talk CUI or CMMC or anything else. And, just, ping me on LinkedIn or something if you're going to be around. And, we certainly can have a chat.
You got a snippet of your talk you're going to give? You got any insight into what people can expect?
We're going to be talking about the business side of CMMC and budgeting for it. Budgeting for IT, budgeting for compliance. That always seems to be a very popular topic. Now, one that gets talked about a lot. People don't talk about it too much, but we'll talk about, how to properly budget for both IT as well as compliance within your IT budget, what that might look like, from a revenue, standpoint, from a, size of company standpoint. That's what we're going to be talking about.
Nice. Well, speaking of February, we got a webinar coming up. Daniel, you and I are going to be on this webinar, February 11th. You got any quick insights into what we'll be talking about?
Yeah, so we're going to talk about a few things. We're going to do the classic rulemaking update. Where are we with 48 CFR? Any general DoD updates per the wonderful Jacob here. And then we're going to move into basically what's the right thing I should do for CMMC, right? What's the quickest thing to get you CMMC certified? But then also what's the better solution long term? Because the last thing you want to do is have to go pick a mediocre solution, maybe get certified, maybe not, and then have to go get recertified again because you realize that solution doesn't actually meet your data flow requirements, right? So there's this kind of tension in the industry of I don't want to have to pay $40,000 to $60,000 multiple times because I picked the wrong solution. And so we're going to go through all of your potential options and looking into the future, like Scott was saying, 12, 24, 36 months. What's the cost of this going to be? And what's the overall kind of business risk if we do this the wrong way? So that's a little sneak peek on what the webinar will be about. We hope you guys join, and we'll drop a link here in chat for you to register if you're interested.
Yeah. Awesome. Speaking of certifications and such, this is the 4th week of, assessments being live by C3PAO. Started the first week. So I think this is week 4. We haven't seen a lot of certifications announced yet, but I think there's a lot in the hopper to talk about as soon as DoD decides to release their artwork. So
we hire a graphic designer, DoD, what's happened? Come on, guys.
I promise that they're gonna come out with the logo that they've been waiting on to keep everybody from announcing their thing, and the only difference is going to be the drop shadow is going to be mildly different on the logo, and I'm gonna yell so loud.
Is that in rulemaking right now? Is the logo?
No, there's no public comments on the CMMC graphic. Yeah. All right, Daniel. Holding companies.
Oh,
What are
man.
holding companies doing for their operating companies? We've heard this more and more recently.
We have, and there's a lot of different kind of options and thoughts behind this, right? Because it gets a little complicated depending on your overall strategy from in talking with these organizations. But this week I had the chance to talk to one that has about half a dozen, somewhere between half a dozen and a dozen operating companies that they oversee. And they're trying to figure out, do I make my shared services at the holding company CMMC compliant, right? And try and service all of them, knowing that maybe not all of those companies need CMMC, but I have to build to the highest watermark for my shared services? Or do I look to outsource that and maybe do enclaves for some of these operating companies and get them independently certified? And so when you're kind of going through the logic of that, a lot of it comes down to, okay, well, when am I going to spin them off? Am I going to try and sell them in the next 12, 24 months? So I want them to have their own tech stack that their CMMC cert can follow.
Yeah.
Or do I want to have to be able to have to, whoever buys them, acquires them, has to get certified again with their new tech stack, right? So there's a lot of kind of complexities in that. And there's not a perfect solution. It's just a solution that's going to best fit your plans for those operating companies.
Yeah, private equity, and those kinds of situations are really interesting for that reason, because they, most companies have a 3 to 5 year hold period. And CMMC certification is 3 years. So, depending on where you are in that hold period and everything goes with it, having it be, packaged to be able to drop in, that's pretty.
Well, and the valuation of that, right? I mean, we had a client that we can, share under NDA certain things with you guys out there. So if you're interested, let us know, that had a 10% increase in their valuation, and they were able to sell for about $100 million more because of their CMMC joint surveillance. Which is crazy to say that. But yeah, so if you want some more information, feel free to reach out and we can kind of disclose some more things there. But yeah, it's definitely it's value added, to say the least, if you do it the right way.
Yeah, absolutely. All righty. Well, Daniel, you and I sit on tons of calls every week. I mean, this is the majority of what happens. And there's been a very interesting trend over the last 2-ish weeks, I would say, more than is when I've really noticed it, is that we're getting calls from companies that you talked to sometimes like 5 years ago, 3 years ago, and then nothing ever since. And then they'll, book a call and they'll be like, how soon can we be done?
Yep. I got an email this morning on our old quote template for some licensing back 4.5 years ago. Hadn't talked to them since. They just kind of ghosted. And then all of a sudden they just popped back up this morning at about 9 a.m. Central Time. So, but yeah, I mean, everyone is starting to just realize how real this is becoming, not because of their own investigative research, because the primes are finally, it feels like, starting to educate more about, if you don't do this, we can't work with you.
Right.
Or if you have minimum scores that are no longer applicable, right? If you do an SPRS. And it's just really interesting because a lot of people are banging down doors saying, we need you to start yesterday. We'll pay you more money to start yesterday. Like, I mean, we're entering almost like a blank check phase, you could say. It reminds me of back when DFARS 7019, 7020 kind of came out, right? People were scared out of their minds, saying, I'm no longer going to be able to do defense work. And within a 30-day window there, everyone was losing it. And we're approaching that window again, I feel like, where the industry's waking up. And although there's not a lot of assessors, which we talk about all the time, there's even fewer implementers than there are assessors. And I can tell you right now, people are not ready. There's no way they're ready.
Well, I mean, today's January 31st, and based off our analysis of the 48 CFR rule and DoD rulemaking in general, phased rollout's going to start in like 4 or 5 months. Conservatively. So, if you tell somebody, hey, you got less than 6 months if you want to be in the first wave there, then you got to make stuff happen. But yeah, it's just been very interesting. The distinct trend of companies that knew what was up 4 or 5 years ago. Now they're like, hey, we want to be ready tomorrow.
So it's funny. I did a poll yesterday on LinkedIn. When does your organization plan to get CMMC certified? Trying to figure out when people are kind of gauging based on the rollout, right? 64% 2025, 17% 2026, 3% 2027. And my favorite number, 16%, self-attest or die. And that's out of about right at 90 votes. And so it's just funny to get a pulse of the industry. A lot of people want to do it this year, which is great. And a lot of people are seeing multiple years, if ever, actually getting certified. So anyways, kind of interesting.
Yeah, and we've talked about this before. We've talked about this on the rulemaking webinars. We've talked about this on the Q&A. We've talked about this on the podcast. I've posted about this multiple times on LinkedIn, and it's just a rumor for now until the alleged guidance gets published. But word on the street is that level 2 self-attestation is not a thing if you handle any of the categories of CUI under the defense grouping in the NARA CUI registry. So if you're handling CTI, NNPI, any of those types of defense data, do not count on self-assessment being your strategy being forward, because there's a good chance that that's not going to work out.
And for those that don't know, distribution statements, DoD distribution statements, are CTI as part of it. So if you're like, I've never seen a CTI marking on my documents, but you're seeing DoD distribution statements B through E, guess what? Get ready for a certification requirement.
Yeah,
absolutely.
We've been saying that for a long time. I mean, you know, we've been.
Yep, absolutely. All righty, let's see here. So we had a couple questions queued up. We'll get into these and we'll get into chat. So one of the ones that comes up all the time, but it was coming up the last couple streams, was, is it cheaper to work with a managed service provider instead of hiring FTEs? You know, is it actually more economical to outsource the work?
We actually have a calculator.
We do. We actually do. Yeah.
So you can check for that on our website. There's a calculator that, you know, takes in some information about the size of your organization, et cetera. Maybe Daniel can pull it up here in a second. But you know, it depends on your side, right? The size of your company and what you have going on. You know, in many cases, for especially smaller companies, it is typically going to be cheaper for you to outsource than it is going to be to try and build a team. The skill sets needed to properly run, manage, you know, a environment to standard are wide. They're varied. They're not something that you're going to find in a single individual. You're going to have a team of individuals to do that. When you look at everything from service desk to engineering to security architects to SOC, you know, running all of those capabilities, you know, that is expensive, and it's not something you do with a single person. And so if you're a 25-person company, you don't want to have to add 3 people to your staff for IT, then, you know, it's definitely going to be cheaper to bring an MSP in. And that's the same, you know, in many cases up to north of a couple hundred employees.
And even then, we're seeing companies even that size with that many supported users can't find the talent.
Yeah.
So even if you wanted to bring it in-house, it's just hard to find the people.
And if you look where the defense industrial base is primarily located, I mean, a large portion of the defense industrial base, a large portion of the contractors are sitting in Northern Virginia,
100%.
DC, Maryland area, which already has a higher cost of living, higher cost of salaries. And then you look at, you know, a lot of the Navy supply chain is in Southern California, higher cost of living, higher cost of salaries. So, you know, all of those pieces come together to really push the needle toward outsourcing in most cases, and especially for small businesses.
And so we actually ran the numbers for 2 different kind of areas, right? The national average for the cost of these types of jobs. And this is about 1.5 years old. So we probably need to maybe revisit a little bit. And then the national capital region, right?
There hasn't been any inflation in the last year.
Yeah. Come on, guys. But yeah, you can tell it is significantly more expensive for a 100-person company to staff the right people than to outsource to an organization that actually knows what they're doing, right? But again, the trick there is know what they're doing. So make sure that people aren't flying false flags, and make sure to do your due diligence on asking all of the right questions. If you need to know what those are, we have a list, kind of an RFP that I've put together, kind of format that's great for you guys to send out. And then, of course, our Pathfinder tool and MSP tool is on the website as well. So,
yep, absolutely. Lots of awesome tools on there. All right. So one of the questions that we had the other day was, does Summit 7 install any software or agents on client networks and devices as part of what we do for our clients? Are we actually like infiltrating their ecosystem and installing things on their endpoints and their network? How does that work?
Yeah, so we do. So we actually have a wide variety of tools that we use. And one of the interesting parts about Summit 7 than most MSPs is we try and go as Microsoft native as possible. we want to maximize your ROI on the licensing that you bought, right? So the full Defender stack from your endpoint to Defender for Identity installed on your local Active Directory server, Defender for Office 365. But then when it comes to the actual endpoint, there is some things that we have to do, right? We have to install an RMM agent, a remote monitoring and management agent. So that allows us to securely connect your endpoint, to see your screen, to troubleshoot why Adobe keeps crashing on you, right? All the way up through allowing us to do patch management, allowing us to run and maintain software inventory and security baselines and things like that. And then we also enhance that on our vigilance side with Qualys, which is a vulnerability management tool to make sure that we're identifying and being able to remediate any vulnerabilities that might be present there. So yeah, there are some third-party tools that we use, but I would say 85-90% of our MSP stack is the licensing that you already own.
Right. With Microsoft, it's the Defender suite, it's Sentinel, it's all of those components that come as part of the M365 E3 or E5 licensing.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, a couple more here, and then we'll get over to chats. So a lot of times we hear people asking, will DFARS 7012, will the main center of gravity of the DFARS clauses go away as a result of the CMMC clause, DFARS 7021 coming around? The answer to that one is no, because DFARS 7012 imposes cybersecurity requirements on you. CMMC imposes the requirement to verify that you have implemented those requirements. But what about 7019 and 7020? Will those go away once DFARS 7021 starts to roll out in contracts? Will it go away during the phased rollout and beyond? The short answer is also no. And the primary reason, the short answer, is the DFARS 7019 and 7020 are the mechanism that gives the DoD the ability to conduct specific audits and investigations into your environment through their DIBCAC auditing team, which is very, very closely related, but a separate process from actual CMMC verification of your requirements in DFARS 7012. They speak to this briefly in the rule. Maybe we'll make a post about this or talk about it on the podcast coming up, but the 7012 and 7008, 7019 and 7020 will not be replaced by 7021 and its provision. They're all very closely related and they work together, but they're not going to replace each other.
Yeah, I mean, you basically look at 7019 and 7020 as the government's right to come assess you.
Yes.
And 7021 is a third party to come assess you, is essentially how to look at it.
Yep.
Yeah. If I recall correctly, the language the language in the 32 CFR final rule is something along the lines of they reserve the right to audit your environment under or pursuant to 7019 and 7020. I don't have the whole thing memorized quite yet. So
Not yet.
Not quite yet. We'll get there. All right. This is one of my favorite questions from the AB Town Hall earlier this week. Will the new Secretary of Defense get rid of CMMC? The short answer here is no. Even if the Secretary of Defense had some grudge against CMMC, the Secretary of Defense cannot overrule a statute, right? CMMC is a framework created pursuant to congressional legislation, Section 1648 of the FY20 National Defense Authorization Act. So no, the short answer is no. The new SecDef is not going to get rid of CMMC because they can't.
For other good questions on the Cyber AB Town Hall, you guys just released a podcast yesterday, right?
Yep.
You and Jason going through them. So if you want to catch some other good questions and answers to those, make sure to check that out too.
Yeah, absolutely. All righty. Quick question for you. We get this one all the time. Is Summit 7 a C3PAO?
Yeah, go ahead.
So Summit 7 is not a C3PAO. We flirted with the idea of becoming a C3PAO. But there's a difference between a C3PAO and what Summit 7 does. Summit 7 is involved in helping an organization get to a compliant state, and then operate and maintain it long term, right? And so because of OCI requirements, we could not be a C3PAO for any of our existing customers. We'd only be able to do assessments for customers that we have not touched in any other way, shape, or form.
Yep.
That being said, we do have a very qualified staff to the point where we have more CCAs and CCPs on staff than the vast majority of C3PAOs do. We have 6 CCAs on staff now. I believe we're at 21 or 22 CCPs on staff. And if you look at the similar numbers across the talent pool within most C3PAOs, and they don't have, most of them are smaller than that. So we basically ensure that up to the point of doing pre-assessments. We make sure you go through implementation, configuration, going into operations and management, continuous monitoring, pre-assessment work. So we can do pre-assessments for you to make sure that you're ready. And then we bring in, or you would bring in, a C3PAO that's outside of Summit 7 that is not part of us. So there's no conflict of interest, so that they can give a fair assessment of the implementation and operations that we're executing on your behalf. So that's pretty much how it is. We are not a C3PAO, and we do not plan on becoming a C3PAO.
Now, we have a lot of good partners that are. So if you do want a list of people that we trust and know in the ecosystem to come do your assessment, we will happily send those to you at any time. So just shoot us a message. We can send those over your way.
That's right.
Yeah, absolutely. All righty, let's see. So let's pull this down. And then we had an interesting question from Jason here. Good afternoon. I have a question about security protection assets. Per the 32 CFR Part 2002, security protection assets are to be assessed against level 2 security requirements that are relevant to the capabilities provided. Based on your expertise and conversations with others in the community, can you provide a few examples, Defender, Sentinel, etc., and what security requirements would be, quote, relevant? Would we be better off assessing against all 320 assessment objectives as identified in NIST SP 800-171 and previous versions? Any into what relevant means for security protection assets?
I have not been able to get a clear answer out of pretty much any C3PAO. It's almost like you have to make your case per one. But have you heard anything, Scott?
No, I haven't heard anything, and I haven't seen DoD or anybody release anything specific. But basically, the way I look at it is, if you're going through and looking at your assessment objectives, and you're looking at, say, a Sentinel environment, right? And you know what the Sentinel environment's doing. It's handling logs. So obviously all the log assessment objectives are going to be applicable there, but maybe not the physical protection asset. Assessment objectives aren't going to be relevant. And so then you don't have to worry about the physical protection asset, component of that in those cases. So you can go down through the 320 and you can kind of understand, if you read them and you read what they're actually looking for, you can see if they're relevant for this specific SPA. But there hasn't been anything, released to my knowledge that says, for a SIM solution, these 17 assessment objectives are relevant. I haven't seen anything like that. I haven't seen anybody even attempt to put that kind of information out.
I haven't either. I wish somebody would, because then you have a blending, right? So you have regular SPAs, but then you have SPAs that process, store, and transmit CUI. So there could be assessors looking at additional controls, right? Maybe a multi-factor challenge, maybe identity protection, something around the axis of that SPA that has CUI, because there's a kind of an extra layer of that, right? So again, we haven't seen any clarifying remarks. I think what Scott said is perfect. Like, look at the controls that apply to that service. And then my recommendation is, if it also processes, stores, and transmits CUI, look a little bit harder.
Or you can just take the risk-averse conservative route and basically make sure everything applies, right?
Absolutely.
That's the risk-averse, I want to make sure that this thing's right. In that case, make sure everything's FedRAMPed and everything meets 800-171. And then you're covered. But other than that, you're going to be making a case with your assessor. And
it goes back to, you need to ask some of these questions to the assessors that you're interviewing, right? I mean, there's a ton of little nuances that people tell us all the time. This is a really big one that challenge that everyone's facing. But ask, hey, I've got these things. These are the types of things that I have implemented. Is something like this what you would deem as relevant, right? And maybe Jacob or Scott, maybe we'll try and get somebody on the live stream, or even just a webinar to kind of walk through relevant controls at some point, just to try and get at least the perspective of an actual C3PAO here.
Yeah, well, we'll definitely do that before CS2, but we're going to have a panel of C3PAOs moderated by our very own Joy Beeland at CS2 Reston. And so if anybody has like some of these gotcha questions, or you're like, we need a C3PAO to answer this thing specifically, we're not technically a C3PAO, right? Then we can ask this at the panel during CS2, but we'll dig into this relevance question before then. But if you are interested in really hammering C3PAOs over some tough questions, then be sure to check out CS2. There's an in-person option, virtual option, and we'll be in the crowd and be like, hey, we got a question from chat for you guys. So we could be on the other end of delivering the questions instead of being asked.
And the great thing about that is we will have 4 months of assessments under the belt.
Yeah.
At that point. So a lot of questions, a lot of these things will have come up.
They should be answered.
They should have answers, right? I mean, you'll have some really good C3PAOs on that panel that have 4 months of running, in some cases, multiple assessments a week for many of these C3PAOs. And so they'll have a lot of experience that they'll be able to bring to bear on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Jacob, I don't know if this is a personal preference. The music stopped. I love the little music background. I don't know if we can cue it back up or not, but I was kind of jamming as I was. There we go. There we go.
Here we go.
People love listening to us talk, but I mean, the music helps a lot. So
it helps a lot. All righty. Let's see here. Tyler has a good question. In the phased rollout and decision to require C3PO certification versus self-assessment entirely to the discretion of the contracting officer, is there a metric of contract size, scope, NACS codes, or things like that that will determine the line between certification and assessment? Short answer is no. There is no such metric where you must have a certain level of self-certification or external certification based off of size, contract type, NACS code. The only determining factor for whether you will be self-assessment or external assessment is the type of data that you handle. And like we were talking about earlier, the word on the street is that if you're handling any of the defense categories of CUI, CTI, NMPI, controlled nuclear information, I can't remember the other one, defense critical infrastructure information, the rumor is that you will not be allowed to self-assess. And so, as far as it goes with DoD contracting officer discretion, the phased rollout says during phase 1, it's going to be CMMC level 1 requirements, except for DoD discretion to include level 2 requirements, self or external certification. And I would not bank on the idea that they are going to knowingly flow naval nuclear propulsion information into the supply chain and be like, well, we're in phase 1, so we require CMMC level 2. What I have heard is that there is a quota for the number of CMMC waivers that would be granted. And so as a result, like we talked about before, CMMC waivers are not what people think. They're for entire contracts, not for individual contractors. And if you were to successfully somehow get a service acquisition executive to go through the process of approving a waiver for an entire contract, there's a bunch of paperwork and justification that they allegedly have to fill out to justify why they're doing that. And there's a reporting that has to happen for why you're going around DoD policy for such a thing. So I think there's actually quotas and limits on waivers rather than the designation for which level that you need. Last point here, Daniel, as you and I have brought up before, if you're a subcontractor to a prime, then you're even more tightly constrained, because if the prime requires CMMC level 2, then anytime they're going to flow CUI to you, then you require CMMC level 2 external certification. They have much less leeway in terms of determining individually whether or not the data that they flow to you retains its identity, as the phrase is in the rules, as CTI. This is in contrast to CMMC 1.0, where it was much more open to prime discretion, but there was a larger number of companies that would be affected by external certification. What they calibrated was a smaller number of companies will need external certification, but now there's no way out of it. So if you're still in that smaller number, much less leeway. So, yeah.
So the other thing with that is most defense contractors don't just have a single contract.
No.
Right? And so if you happen to have the one contract that allows self-attestation, you're not going to have 10 of them.
No.
Right? You're going to get caught by that net.
Russian roulette, the house is going to win at some point.
I mean, you're not going to end up with 10 different self-attestation contracts. So if you are doing more work than a single contract, every time it's just a power of 2, right?
Yep.
Every time you add a contract, you get that, that likelihood that you're going to end up with a flow down that's going to require it. So,
well, and my favorite question for you to answer, Jacob, because I've asked this before, how many people can give the exemption? You mentioned a specific role there.
Yeah.
I mean, is this like 100 people are able to write the paperwork to exempt? Is this 500, 1,000? Like, how many people the DoD can actually issue a waiver at a contract level?
Yeah, CMMC waivers for entire contracts or classes of acquisitions are approved by service or component acquisition executives, and there are maybe 10 of these people in the DoD. You're talking about the chief of acquisitions for the Navy, for the Army, for the Air Force, plus a couple of other folks that maybe have that level of authority. So you're talking about a very, very small number of people. And as we've talked with Lauren Ayers and Michael Gruden and some of our friends who are former contracting officers at CS2 and on the podcast in the past, the level to which a contracting officer is quote unquote sticking their neck out and asking for deviations, variances, waivers, approvals, and rocking the boat inside of the dynamic of DoD acquisitions to try to get a CMMC waiver for an entire contract is not a thing that the system is oriented for, right? That's just not really the way that the internal dynamics work. So it's a very small number of people that could approve it, very high bar for actually approving it, lots of paperwork justifying the approval. So I would not count on waivers as a thing that would be a saving grace, especially because if you're an individual company, that's not how the waivers work. And like you said, Scott, if you have multiple contracts, the odds of you getting waivers for all of them over any length of time is basically zero.
Yep.
All righty. Daniel says, do you have any details on the skill sets needed for the various positions that you're listing in the context of CMMC? So a lot of times we say, oh yeah, one person isn't going to necessarily have all the skills needed for all this stuff. What are some examples of the things that you would need multiple people for?
So general skill sets, we're looking at basic technical, right? So first they have to understand that. They have to have a background and framing of the impact of their changes to the 320 assessment objectives.
Change management is huge.
Change management. You got to have change management background and understanding of that and how to work within that, right? What requires change management, what doesn't, right? Which is kind of a native support function. And then you got to go all the way up to being able to walk through an assessment, configure multiple different types of clouds that you might have. Configure multiple different on-prem systems that you might have, right? Windows, Mac,
endpoint
Linux, endpoint management. So when you're looking over, CMMC really does touch pretty much every major part of your business, because CUI at some point probably flows in there unless you've gotten a little creative with obfuscating or backlinking into where that CUI is in your organization. So they've got to be able to take a top-down approach at a more executive level, understanding the full asset inventory and data flow. And then all the way down at the very bottom, your tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 have to understand the impact of change management. What if they don't do change management as part of that, right? And then you have to track all of that, right? So you have to look at the whole life cycle and track and make sure everyone's following it. So you have to enforce it.
Then if you just look at the pure technical skills that are needed, networking technical skills, security operations, skill set, it just continues to build on itself. Yep. And then if you even look within the Microsoft stack, M365, you've got to have Exchange skill set. You've got to have Purview skill set for data management, DLP and labeling and all of those skill sets. You've got to have the ability, audio conferencing, Teams, do you have that, the phone background. So all of these are skill sets that have to be used at some point or another. Some of them you can offset with projects because they don't necessarily have to be done all the time. The ongoing management and operations aspect are going to be your continuous monitoring, your security operations center, your vulnerability management, vulnerability remediation. All of those skill sets are part of the need as well. So it's very, very difficult for a company of 25 or 50 people to have all of those skill sets in-house. It's just really challenging.
And you had that little asterisk, right? Because a lot of these platforms you have to get GovCloud versions of them. So not only if they came back from a background of knowing Microsoft Commercial, they probably don't know the nuances of how to do that stuff in Microsoft Gov.
And they're getting closer.
Feature parity.
The feature parity is getting a lot closer, but there are still some differences. But Microsoft is getting the feature parity a lot closer. So those skill sets do more directly apply. But still, having all those skill sets in a single person is very challenging.
Well, as Ryan Bonner says, they probably won't be there tomorrow, right? Lockheed's going to write them a $400,000 check to come help them do their CMMC compliance.
Yeah, and if they have those skills, we've probably already hired them. So So, and we'll outsource them to you for cheaper than it would cost for you to hire them, like we talked about earlier. You're looking for, for the elder millennials in the audience, you're looking for Napoleon Dynamite. Somebody with nunchuck skills, bow hunting skills, computer hacking skills. If you don't get the reference, ask your parents. It's a good movie.
Tina.
Eat your ham sandwich. All right, Sam is here. He says, I'm sure you've covered this already. If we won't be handling ITAR data, would GCC suffice, or would you still recommend GCC high?
This is an oldie but a goodie.
It's a
right?
classic.
It's a
I love
classic.
it. Keep at it.
Powerful headshot on Sam here. I just want to take a moment here to appreciate Sam's ultra clean headshot. Good job, Sam.
All right, I've got a slide per norms here. Give me 1 second. Where are you, slide?
Well, really, while you bring that up, Daniel, Scott, what is GCC? What is GCC high? It's another acronym. What does this mean?
Sure. So GCC stands for Government Community Cloud, and then Government Community Cloud High. The difference between the two is the GCC M365 environment is built on the commercial infrastructure.
Yep.
So it is essentially you have the commercial stack, you have the GCC stack, both built on and essentially working with inside Azure Commercial, right? And so that is kind of a commercial data center. Then you have the Gov data centers that have Azure Government, and then built alongside and on top of Azure Government, you have Government Community Cloud High, right? And so those are the two infrastructures that you're really looking at. FCI data, or what is now CFI data. Is that right? Is that the new term?
Control federal information.
Yeah, it's not technically the right term until the FAR CUI rule is final, but yeah, that will be the term in the future.
So FCI data, if you only have FCI data, you are fine in commercial. You can do everything you need to do with CFI/FCI data in commercial, no worries. If you have standard basic CUI data, non-ITAR, non-specified CUI, you can do that in GCC, all right? That being said, one of the challenges that you run across is many companies like to pursue various contracts.
Yep.
And if you build out your environment in GCC, you essentially are shutting the door at that point on any contracts that may require you to handle ITAR content at some point in the future. And so most companies don't want to shut the door on that possibility simply because they haven't built in the right environment. And so what we see, at least, in my experience, and I think Daniel, you can attest to this because you're talking to a lot more companies than I am right now. Most companies go ahead and move into GCC High simply because they want to leave the door open for being able to pursue those contracts that handle ITAR, export controlled, CUI specified content.
I'm going to take a guess and say out of our 1,000 or so clients, 5% are in GCC. Less than that, 3%.
I want to say we have, of 1,000 plus, we may have 10 to 15.
Yeah. So, I mean, people are like, yes, GCC High is more expensive, 30 to 40%, depending on their license SKU, but you're hedging your bets, right? The last thing we do is pigeonhole yourself into a position where you can't go after the new work after you spent all this time getting CMMC certified.
I mean, we have a customer that we're talking to right now that they've been a customer off and on for years, right? They were in commercial.
Yep.
We moved them to GCC High.
Yep.
They then decided that, we don't need to be in GCC High anymore. So we moved them back to commercial.
Yep.
And now they've come back again and said, those contracts, we really do need to be in GCC High. So
please
now we're
put us
moving
back
in.
Yeah.
So it's crazy. But yes.
Well, I mean, what's the big deal? You just push the GCC High button and then you just switch it over, right?
If Microsoft had that, that would be wonderful.
So that's not what you want to do because that's obviously very expensive, very time consuming, very disruptive to the business. To do all of those moves. And so the vast majority of companies just decide to go into GCC High and build out that infrastructure there and move forward.
Awesome. Okay. Well, for everybody, we have the hotline. You can always call and leave a message and we can answer your question online. The CUI hotline page also has a form that you can fill out if you'd rather do that in order to ask your question. We had a form question come in from the great and powerful Sydney. So I will read it and then we can go through the answer here. So she is asking this on behalf of one of their affiliates. Most of their software developers work on a main enterprise network, which will have all of the required controls at CMMC level 2 inside of NIST SP 800-171 revision 2. Developers do not need admin privileges on this enterprise network in order to complete their tasks. However, some of the development work involves the design and configuration of workstation hardware, in addition to creating software code and things like that. This tasking inherently requires admin privileges. Because of the risk this involves, we do not allow these devices to be on the enterprise network. Instead, we set up very small, air-gapped, isolated, no internet, network, lab environments that consist of 1 to a few workstations, and they allow the developers to have full admin rights on everything. To make it easier, I'll refer to this as the pink network, the pink lab, if you will. So developers must follow a well-defined process to add data to this environment. Typically, the IT team pulls documents, code, executable software to a malware-free USB drive, then gives them the drive to the development team to put onto their pink network devices. In general, the developers can't pull any data out of this network. They can't have it introduced into the enterprise network or anywhere else without specific IT team involvement. When the project is over, all equipment on the pink network is sanitized and then either reused or disposed of properly. IT does not have the full set of 800.171 controls implemented on this developer test network. We will definitely be placing CUI into this pink development test network, and our protocol, if followed, ensures that CUI that lands in this environment is controlled, but we cannot apply all of the NIST controls on this network. So how can this scenario be acceptably handled from a scoping perspective? In the eyes of an assessor, would the pink development network fall under the scope of requiring all 110 controls being implemented? Or can it be treated as a lab extension of the enterprise environment, which has the CMMC level 2 requirements fully implemented? Thanks, Sydney. Excellent question. Excellent background information.
Very good question. Great context. Thank you for that. So when Jacob and I and Scott were kind of looking over this question, the first thing that came to my mind was, of course, the CMMC L2 scoping guide. So I'm going to pull that up real quick. And you use the word test multiple times. So this seems to be a very applicable fit, you could say. Means hardware and or associated IT components used in the testing of product, system components, and contract deliverables. It can include hardware or associated IT components used in the testing of product, system components, and contract deliverables. Now, it does use some oscilloscopes, spectrum analyzers, power meters, special test equipment. I would very likely put this into the category of what's referred to as a specialized asset, because specialized assets can process, store, transmit CUI. However, they don't have to have all 110 controls applied. And the fact that you've isolated that environment and the fact that you have applied as many applicable controls as you see fit to manage the cyber security of that asset, I think it's a very easy play to say that would fall into a specialized asset category. As we've talked about a lot, assessing is a little bit of art and science, right? There's general guardrails that assessors have to play by, which is what the CAP is and what the scoping guidance is. So I would ask you to ask all the assessors you're interviewing this particular question, just to make sure that you guys have alignment on this. But I would point them to this document and say, this is test equipment for us to do the job that is required on the contract. We have a security policy around this environment, and here's proof of that we're actually doing this, right? So Scott, anything you want to chime in on?
I just want to say on the question itself, the process that they have seems pretty solid.
Yes.
If having that written up, the policy around that, the process around that, work instructions about how you move content into the environment, the sanitization of the environment, when you're done with it, all of those are very, very good, processes and controls to have in place. So, just having that conversation with the assessor, right up front is probably the best way to handle that.
100%.
Yeah. Another idea here to consider, although it's maybe a little riskier, but it's potentially more foolproof if you're able to work the system correctly. I apologize for this small size of the text. If you look in your DFARS 7012 clause, there is language in there that says the contractor shall submit requests to vary from NIST SP 800.171 in writing to the contract officer for consideration by the DoD CIO. Typically, people just email the DoD CIO inbox that's listed in their contract for individual control variations or the designation that an individual requirement is not applicable to your environment. So if you were to provide that information in that email to the DoD CIO, there's a chance that they will positively adjudicate that decision. And then you've got an official piece of paper from on high that says these are not applicable. People have had varying luck going through that process. So it's an option for you to try. That's the sort of old school way of trying it. But one of the things that I thought of as we were going through this question was talking about how this is an air-gapped network. There's no connectivity whatsoever. So the first example that's the easiest is, well, obviously the Wi-Fi requirements won't apply to this environment because there is no basis for that requirement to apply. Do you need to go through the variation request process of DoD CIO to make that a true thing? The way that it's sort of played out in reality is that people don't need to do that as far as designating controls as NA, but that's a very clear-cut example. If there are other edge cases that you're like, well, we can't do this for some various reason, but the technical basis for the requirement to be in place, it might be a little hazier for your own determination that something is NA, but I don't know if that was actually the situation or not. Good example, this question of what about test environments? Is this a sufficient test environment? We can add this to the queue for our C3PAO panel at CS2 Reston if you didn't know that this was happening. Discount code scrolling across the bottom of the screen for 15% off of registration. We can add this to the agenda for CS2 Reston. All righty, let's see here. Jonathan asked, quick question regarding system security plan. Should it include the CMMC scope statement, data flow diagrams, asset inventories? Should this be a separate document? I don't think that this is a killer requirement here where your design decision of all this paperwork together is all going, it's all complementary, and this is the SSP, or this is our SSP and this is our data flow diagram, and they're separate documents. I don't think that anybody is gonna have a huge issue if they're technically separate documents, as long as you have all of them.
Yeah, it's important to have the information. How you structure it is in many cases left up to you.
Yep, just make sure you can pull it up fast.
Yeah, absolutely. All righty. Let's see. Another great question from Jonathan here. Question regarding ServiceNow. Even though CMMC Level 2 does not require ServiceNow to be FedRAMP moderate if it does not store or transmit CUI, would you recommend to still go with the FedRAMP moderate version?
Well, I'll answer that as someone who had to make this decision, I guess.
Perfect.
Yeah. So you're right. It does not necessarily have to store CUI. Depending on the situation, there are possibilities for it to process, store, or transmit CUI. For example, if a document was attached to a ticket as it was submitted, screenshot, something like that was submitted as a ticket, goes into ServiceNow, and now your ServiceNow has CUI in it. When we deployed ServiceNow, we did deploy in the FedRAMP environment, in the Gov environment. And that's pretty much how we built our entire stack. We took a very risk-averse approach to all of our cloud platforms, all of our platforms in general, and basically went FedRAMP everywhere. So that's how we did it.
You get a FedRAMP.
Yeah. So that's the decision we made. It is the more risk-averse decision. Are there ways to potentially get around that decision? Possibly, but I think that there are also significant possibility that you would end up cleaning up CUI in that environment and treating it as a spillage at some point in the future.
Yeah, I get this question all the time on the M365 side of the house. It's like, what do I need to do to kind of deem an asset out of scope, right? And it says in the CMMC L2 guide, be prepared to justify that out of scope asset, right? And so what controls are you putting in place in a non-FedRAMP that shouldn't have CUI, but it is still in your organization, right? And so just like, putting DLP policies in place for things outbound, making sure you're doing content scans and some sort of health check around your non-CUI systems to make sure that, I don't know, users didn't decide to put a file somewhere they shouldn't put it, right? So that's kind of the extra piece on this. And that could be a cumbersome task depending on how large your organization is. I mean, that could be a job for somebody.
And for us as a service provider, I mean, we have lots of customers.
Yep.
And so customers aren't necessarily going to always abide by our policies.
That's right.
So they're going to send us stuff even if we don't want it in some cases. So we had to go ahead and prepare for that potential eventuality. Which is why we decided to go FedRAMP pretty much across the board.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. All righty. Nelson says, do you need FIPS encryption on every printer? Are these printers considered CUI assets? Your favorite topic, Daniel?
Printers, Daniel.
Scott and I were just wrestling with a printer about an hour and a half ago. Anyways, printers and phone systems, as a recovering IT guy, are the two things that I've always hated in life. So I'll just go ahead and leave that out there for the world. Okay. Anything that process, stores, or transmits CUI is going to be in scope. asterisks unless you're protecting the confidentiality of that CUI through other means, aka FIPS validated cryptography, right? You're wrapping up an encryption, you're holding the private keys, therefore the things cannot, see the plain text information. Now, printers by default, because printers are the worst, send print jobs in a plain text format. So if I have a plain text print job coming from my print management server to my printer, it's going to transverse this network. This network, if not configured correctly, is now in scope, right? Because now plain text CUI is just running through it, and it's going to get to my printer at the other end, right? I might have accounting turned on, and I might have my 1234 pin code or my badge to release that job. And then you have physical protection that you have to, labels or in shredders and storage and all that fun stuff that follows after that. But what I tell people is you really have two options. Option number one is, and Jacob, you're not going to believe this, I just made a slide about this because it's become such a question.
The magical slide deck.
I'm telling you guys, like Microsoft, if anything ever happens to me here at Summit 7, I can be a PowerPoint guy. Let me tell you. Okay. Feel free to take a screenshot of this because, well, I can't stop you from doing it. But these are the questions I get all the time about, can I add a printer to my enclave? Right. And it's just like, of course you can, but should you, right? How much of your on-prem do you want to bring in scope? So if you are going to bring that in scope and try and leave your network out of scope, then you have to actually have that printer have a FIPS validated driver, the print management server running in the enclave. That way, when you're queuing up the print job from the enclave itself, it's sending encrypted all the way through to the actual printer, which would be a carve out of your network on-prem. Now, you still have the printer itself. You want to make sure that's in a protected room. So when you release the job and, yada, yada, yada. But here are a couple of examples of, do printers have to have FIPS? It depends on how much of your environment you want to have in scope.
What about at rest when it sits on that drive inside the printer?
Well, you can have physical compensating controls. So if you have a locked room and you have the protections in place for people to even get to that printer, then you're going to be okay. Assuming people that can't remote into it and pull that job out in a plain text.
And what if you're leasing your printer? You don't own your printer. And now what do you do with that drive when that printer gets replaced because it's not yours in the first place and they come to replace it?
It's not yours in the first place. That's when you have to have some fun contract language about authorized users and destruction and change, what do you call it? Authorized handoffs and things of that nature, right? Yeah.
Printers get sticky.
Well, and also there's cloud print options now. So now if I'm using a cloud printer, Ricoh has them, I think, Canon, Xerox. Well, now my cloud SaaS print job manager has to be FedRAMPed, right? So printers,
FedRAMP printers,
like they have been forever, are the worst. And if you want a copy of this or have any other questions about your specific thing, feel free to reach out directly. But yeah, you got some options. I can't say any of them are great. So God bless you in your printer journey.
Awesome. All righty. Interesting individual control question here. With regard to the requirement 3.9.1, which is personnel screening, how do we navigate this requirement without breaking laws on discrimination? Has DoD provided guidance on what reasons to say a candidate is ineligible to access CUI? So I'll bring this up for everybody in case you don't have 3.9.1 handy. So under the personnel security family, requirement 3.9.1 is screen individuals prior to authorizing access to organizational systems containing CUI. On the right-hand side is the 171A verification procedure for this. So screen individuals prior to authorizing access to organizational systems containing CUI. Determine if the individuals are screened prior to authorizing that access. That's the only check that you have. The only information that you have in the discussion section is personnel security screening or vetting activities involve the evaluation assessment of individuals' conduct, integrity, judgment, loyalty, reliability, and stability. Basically, the trustworthiness of the individual prior to authorizing access to organizational systems containing CUI. The screening activities reflect applicable federal laws, executive orders, directives, policies, regulations, and specific criteria established for the level of access required for assigned positions. Personally, I like the way that the discussion section is written for the corresponding control in 853 more than the one in 171. So if you look at the control from which 3.9.1 is derived, PS3, they'll say that examples of personnel screening include, which is not in the language in 171.
Come on, 171. What are we doing?
Background investigations, agency checks. Organizations may define different rescreening conditions and frequencies for personnel accessing systems on the types of information processed, stored, or transmitted by systems. And then you can always double check the 853 evaluation criteria that corresponds to the controls. Always, 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 I highly recommend, if you're digging into individual requirements in 171, check the corresponding control from which it's derived, because there's usually extra information in there that will help clarify. So are you breaking discrimination laws by screening individuals to have access to CUI, Scott and Daniel?
No. Do
Now-
your background checks.
Yeah. And there's a layer past this.
Yep.
CUI could also be export control
Yeah,
information.
if it's CUI specified.
Yeah, which the
then now
Department
you
of
got
State has
ITAR.
some real concerns about,
Yeah.
right?
So now you've got U.S. persons requirements. You've got licensing requirements potentially
Yep.
if you want to go that route. So yeah, you have to look at the entire scope of all of your data and the potential data that these people could have access to. Do the appropriate background checks, as said, in 853, and you should be fine.
Green cards all the way up to U.S. citizens. It can vary with
It can
export
vary.
controls. So
Yep.
Awesome. All righty. Let's see here. SRM, WTH. What the hell is a shared responsibility matrix?
Somebody really sent that in?
Okay. First off, why did they rename it in the CMMC? It's client responsibility, right? Isn't that what
Right.
they renamed it to?
Yeah.
So that's probably part of the confusion. But this is, and Scott knows this because he has slaved God knows how many hours in Excel rows behind our SRM here for the company. But it is alignment with what we will do as a service provider and then what you are responsible for. Now, the really good ones, I hate to say, we have the really good one, also attaches a racy component to it.
Yeah.
With names, titles, and understanding of whose name do you call out for that assessment objective or for the totality of that control, right? And so an SRM is 171 to the 320 assessment objectives. Don't just do top level 110.
Yep. Who's doing what?
Who's doing what?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, when we developed our SRM, we have one for each service offering,
Yep.
right? We have, Guardian for M365. We have Guardian for Azure. We have Vigilance. And then we have, our upcoming service, Commander,
Yep.
that is in beta and will be released here shortly, hopefully. But basically, it breaks it down. Are we responsible for it? Are you responsible for it? Do we share it? And then when you get down to actually the SRM that you get as a customer,
Yep.
there's a lot of words that go behind that to explain you're responsible for this part of it. We're responsible for this part of it. And, we have to work together. So that shared it's really a shared responsibility matrix. I don't look at it as a customer responsibility matrix. It really is a shared responsibility matrix because they have to understand what you're doing. You have to understand what they're doing. And, oh, by the way, even if you don't have anything outsourced, you still need to do this internal to your organization, because within your organization, you're going to have IT has a specific set of responsibilities. Personnel is going to have a specific set of responsibilities. Physical building management is going to have a specific set of responsibilities. And somebody's going to be making decisions on all these policies. And so you need to have a shared responsibility matrix within your organization, even if you do not have anything outsourced to an outside organization. The departments within your company are going to have different responsibilities, and those are going to be shared for these assessment objectives.
100%. And it's one of the most commonly overlooked things. If you're using external service providers and they don't have this, red alert.
Right.
If your internal organization doesn't want to help you craft this, red alert.
Well, the problem is you get into an assessment and you have your building person, your HR team, you have your internal IT team, you've got your help desk, and they're all sitting around a table, and the assessor asks a question, and then everybody does that.
Yeah, the Spider-Man meme, right?
Right.
It's like,
oh, I thought you were answering that.
That's right.
Right. And no, that does not go well.
It does not go well.
And I'll show you a great example of the limitations of outsourcing to an external service provider. Even if you fully outsource and spend your money on every single thing that Summit 7 can offer you, we cannot do everything inside of your requirements. You can't outsource 100% of this work. So just to go back to the personnel screening family as a quick example, if you only look at the requirement 3.9.2, ensure that organizational systems containing CUI are protected during and after personnel actions such as terminations and transfers, and the company or person or whoever that you're trying to partner with to facilitate this requirement has their SRM mapped to just that level at 171, they'll tell you, yeah, we can do that for you. But if you look at the corresponding verification procedures in 171A for 3.9.2, the first thing that you have to check is that there is organizational policy for terminating system access and any credentials that coincident with personal actions is established. So there's organizational policy that has to be established. There has to be a management decision by the company. We cannot do that for you, right? And if you are outsourcing policy decisions, you're going to have a tough time during your assessment. Now, what a company like Summit 7 can do is stuff like item B and C, so that system access and credentials are terminated consistent with personnel actions such as termination or transfer pursuant to organizational policy. So on an SRM that is properly mapped to 171A on a RACI matrix, something like 3.9.2A would say that's your responsibility, and something like 3.9.2B and C will say this is our responsibility. This is why if you really dig back into things like
how we do it.
Yeah, that's exactly how we do it.
Yeah. And if you dig back into things like NIST 853 in the first 3 chapters, these are hybrid controls where you control part of the requirement and somebody else would control part of the requirement. And almost all of the requirements in 171 and 853 are hybrid in nature, in the sense that you can outsource a lot of it, 70, 80% or more of it, but you can't outsource 100% of it.
Nope.
So make sure you have your SRM mapped to 171A. It is the clearest Rosetta Stone to know if you are being taken for a ride by somebody who tells you that they can to do it all for you. So don't fall for it.
In 3 days.
That's right.
In 3 days. All righty. Let's see here. All right. Well,
by the way.
Yeah. So let's see. All right. Well, we're at an hour already. We've got some questions in chat that we didn't get a chance to get to. We've got stuff that's queued up that we didn't get a chance to get to. So we will queue those up for next week. We're here every Friday. We have a podcast every Thursday. We got CSU coming up in May. We've got a webinar coming up in February. Scott's going to be out and about at various events across the ecosystem in February and beyond. If you got questions after you see this video, feel free to leave it in the comments and we'll queue that up. You can always go to CUIHotline.org and either leave us a voicemail or fill out the form and we'll queue those up as well. And we'll see you guys next week.
Have a good one, guys.
Have a good one.